Thank you very much for this quick presentation. So welcome all of you for this very first roundtable. So this one is going to be about the first feedback on conservation easement. I'm Renaud de Laâge, and you have to be. I'm going to be moderating this panel. Before we get down into the nitty-gritty, let me just tell you. So let me tell you about this conservation easement. These terms are not usual. In French, ORE, so we've got this word in French, obligation. And obligation, it points towards a contract that governs all the provisions of the civil code. That means there has to be a public authority. Generally, it's a notary, and it could also be, for instance, someone who's in charge of public service. And we've also got this term called real. Real means that it is attached to land, and that's what gives it a certain specificity of conservation easement. That means a landowner who signs it, when he sells this land, this ORE or conservation easement will follow the land and not the person, and that's why it's real and it's not personal. So that's why it's useful, this kind of provision. And this also means that this is not a servitude. It's not an easement like we have in France. This is not the case. In fact, an easement is an obligation of things that you cannot do. So in this present case, we can call it an obligation. And of course, we have Mr. Martin over here, who is a specialist in this particular field, and I'm going to call upon our joint intelligence. And then finally, environmental. Environmental means what is the end result of all these obligations. So these obligations and their aim is to maintain, conserve, manage, and restore elements in biodiversity and ecological functions. And it's an extremely large term.
Because there can be some obligations of small size and some significant ones. So it depends on what the parties want to do. I'm going to continue to conclude about the legal framework that you're going to see is extremely short, because it's Article 133.3 of the Environmental Code, which is 14 lines. It's 14 lines, but it's very little. And you might as well have a look at it if it's not already done. This is what says the purpose of the obligation, I've already said. It reminds us that the parties can be an owner or a physical person or a co-contractor who is a guarantor, which is limited. It can be a public community, a public establishment, or a legal person acting on behalf of the environment. There are other indications about the duration, the maximum duration.
No, it's this one. It's this one.
So there are several modes. And you have third parties. There is a rural lease. Now, depending on whether they're going to be signing. You've also mentioned hunting. Implementing an ORE cannot be detrimental to hunting in any way, so they can be reserved areas. So a few other points about exemption from recording fees, and in the general tax code, it's possible to have an exemption for tax on the non-built areas, and the music code says you can mobilize OREs for environmental compensation, but there are two types of OREs. Some are compensatory, and all of the others, actual practice, they can be named as a heritage ORE. Another contractual framework, you can do what you want, basically. A contract between an owner and a guarantor contractor, and guarantees of an environmental nature, whatever you want. In terms of the actual field and of application, and which makes it possible for us to have a tool that can be adapted to just about any situation. But we don't even know how far OREs can go in France. And in this framework, since the OREs have been around since 2016, and everybody knows, it seemed to us to be opportunistic to get into the first feedback, to look at the current status of things and to draw some conclusions about that first experience. So to do that, I'd like to welcome Pascal Bargiarelli. You're in charge of evaluating incidents in the Natura 2000 and environmental obligations in the Ministry of Ecological Transition. Fabrice Normand, who's the Director of the Conservation of the Loire region. Hello. Marie-Hélène and Tanguy. You are owners of the farm called Maison Neuve in the Vendée region at la Ferrière, and you signed that obligation with the conservation of in the Loire region. Mr. Yannick Barascud, who's the coordinating of the biodiversity pole in agriculture and territory in the Pyrenees, which makes it possible to now, let's have a word about acronyms in terms of biodiversity. There are a lot of them. Notably, we will have at the end of the panel discussion the opportunity to hear Mr. Romain Melot, Director of Research at INRAE. Mr. Guillaume Pain is a researcher at INRAE who's going to be presenting a project on hunting. It's called the Emblem Project. So much for the introduction. Now I suggest that we move on into the main issue and the main topics. Can everybody hear me? Fantastic. So we're going to start the panel discussion, and it's going to be broken down into three sections. First of all, we're going to be talking about OREs, to go over where it stands and to see where it fits in the strategy. And we're going to start with the Ministry of the Environment. Pascal Bargiarelli, is your microphone working, sir? Is everything's going well? You work for the Ministry of the Environment, and I wanted to ask you a question, and maybe to start with, perhaps you can, from the point of view of the ministry, could you give a general report on the actual application of the OREs in France? Where do we stand? Hi, everyone. As well, where we stand. Very recently, up until 2 years ago, we didn't have very precise data because there was no systematic feedback from OREs. In 2021, 3 years ago, there was a governmental report produced by the Parliament which tried to see where some 20 ROEs that were indicated, but obviously that is not all of the data that we need in natural spaces. But so this report talked about restricted development, but how can I put this? There's a recognition of the tools for compensation in the framework of biodiversity, because very quickly operators such as Sistra Foncier identified this tool, which makes it possible to secure compensation, environmental compensation measures, so that when you have a project that's subject to compensate the detrimental effects, if they sign an ORE, it's linked to the land by definition, so it remains applicable, even if the actual purpose of the coverage is no longer there. So we're in a more restricted area of development. So, in fact, since July 22, we've had feedback, more exhaustive feedback about the number of contracts that were signed. So all of the contracts that are signed are then logged in the real estate publications that are statutory in charge of the real estate. So we have feedback then. It's not exhaustive. We don't have a precise estimate of the actual surface area. We have information that is not, so we try to have more of that information. But since 22, between July 22 and the end of 23, what's indicated here is that we have 130 that were signed in a year and a half. So I can't say it was unsuccessful. And so I think that we can consider that there are at least 200 that have been signed to date. It's difficult to have precise data because we don't. It goes back to 22. But in terms of compensation, there are projects where there can be dozens of contracts, but which can be. They might not be very ambitious. They're REs, they're kind of promises of REs. I don't know if they're concrete yet, which had to do with setting up an e-choix. So it's a very plastic tool. Yes, there are hundreds of promises that were planned. I don't know if they came to fruition. So there are more than 200. We believe that more than 200 exist today. 130 were signed off between 22 and the beginning of 23. And so there's a significant development for 23, and there's an increase, a very strong increase. If only in the region, there was an article almost every 10 days about OREs. So there's also media coverage that's nationwide. And France 5 TV station, they're very strongly interested in the OREs, and they're going to do a new program on it soon. About these 130 contracts signed in a year and a half, there are 75 that are voluntary. With a purpose, initially, it was in designing the OREs was based on that, and 55 in the framework of protection against impact on biodiversity. So there we are. Insofar as the geographical level, we think that there are contracts that were signed in all regions and in 2 overseas regions, in Guyana and the Reunion Island. So I'd like to draw attention to one region, which we noted is that there are very few water projects. There are regions for which there's a strong involvement of the conservation authorities. So I'm not going to try to flatter members of the panel discussion, but in fact, in Normandy, there are quite a few that were signed, and the national and regional parks. There are other players outside of the natural space authorities that are strongly involved. The regional areas were involved, and hunting federations. They're a little under 10, I think, hunting federations. And in 23, there were 2 associations that communicated on the OREs, Agir pour l'Environnement and ASPAS. It's an association with the purpose of protecting nature. Thank you for the feedback. And very briefly, from a strategic point of view, what's the idea of the ministry in using this tool? Well, really, an ORE is a tool that's available. It's extremely flexible. There's no instructions. The state does not have to look at the ORE contracts unless when they're registered. So the services of the state are not involved unless they want to be. The strategy was, first of all, to get the word out. And that's why there's a guideline that's published since 2018. It's a kind of a sheet where we update, and the new one will be out in a few weeks. So that's a technical public service. There are meetings for providing information. There are quite a few of those. With the French Office for Biodiversity, there's a webinar this year, and there are several colloquia that will be organized over the year. And in fact, this is really a tool for exposure. And there's an ascending logic. There's no... We're bringing things to light, and we're not talking about where it's working or where it's not working. But there is something in the framework of deriving value from the tool, but for the tax authorities, since the tool was created, there are tax advantages as soon as you create this. These areas are logged, and there's no... there are no specific... many taxes are exonerated. In fact, for the ownerships and buildings that are on the land. We'll have a practical example of that. Yes, some townships have set that up. There are at least 10 now so far. So we have the data on those. And it's also something that's planned to do this year. We're going to be communicating more to the townships, the legislation in the framework of the webinar. That's what we're going to be talking about. So we have to communicate to the French mayor's group so we can inform them that this is available. So, as I was saying, in 2021, there was a report to the government, to the parliament by the government. We're working on additional tax measures. Subsequent to this work on the parliamentary report in 21, the advantages were broadened, because no longer any cost of actual recording the act, and real estate security as well, which is no longer required of them. There's also a possibility that grouped communes, grouped townships can also engage non-built-up areas in this framework. Thank you so much for this quantitative and qualitative report. If I summarize, it's a tool which is on the rise. That's what we've observed recently, since between 2021 globally. We had a moderate use, and there's an increase. So with respect to the strategy of the ministry, it's a tool that is made available to players, and you're going to see that there are a lot of players, indeed, who decided to take this by hand. I'm going to hand over to Yannick Barascud. Before I do that, we had some quantitative feedback with OREs, both compensatory and patrimonial. Now, we need to frame in the topic, and in the panel discussion now, we're going to be looking only at OREs which are patrimonial. In other words, so they're not for compensation. We could do another ones for compensation, if anybody's interested. Mr. Yannick Barascud, you work in the Natural Regional Park in the Pyrénées and Ariégeoises. Perhaps you could present what is a regional national park and to talk about what your park is, and maybe give us a bit of feedback on the real environmental obligations in the Natural Regional Park. So welcome. In the world of natural parks, there are 58 national regional parks in France, both in so if we zoom in at the bottom, you'll see that there's a cross-border one with Andorra and with Spain. That's the Pyrénées Ariégeoises Park. If we broaden that out, we can see that the park is the Pyrenees Park of 3 nations, which groups together 4 parks in Andorra and Spain around the biodiversity area, when there's a project for a transborder biosphere. Now, in Ariégeoise Pyrenees area, this is a transborder. It's from 1,500 to 3,000 meters high. There are hills, and you have some high mountains as well. That's what you can see in the background. That's a fairly high peak in the Ariégeoises area, and all the knowledge around that, because it's not just an area to be protected, but also we're benefiting from knowledge and culture and so forth. So a regional or national park is a part of the quality of the area. There's community and township involvement, and this is part of the Occitania area. If we can zoom in, you can see the surrounding area. If you can see Toulouse, we're in the north-south axis from Toulouse. If you want to know where the Ariège is, that's where it is. So it's not Ardèche, it's different. So it's a rural area, not very dense from a human point of view. So there's a balance between open area and forested area. It's very rich in this with this mixture of various types of occupation of the ground. We welcome economic activities that are often rural or agricultural with know-how of the same areas, and it's really relatively not impacting. So there's a lot of biodiversity out there. So in this framework, you sign ORE obligations. It's appearing little by little. In the park, we have signed currently 3 OREs, which represent 40 hectares. There are 7 owners, and commitments from 15 to 99 years. If we go back to the scale of the park, I have a vision that's slightly not as broad as the ministry. It's between 20 and 30 OREs in this natural park, which made it possible for me to see a little bit what the deployment would be and the spread of possibilities that we're basing this on, other than the OREs for compensation purposes, because Guyane has signed some. And the ways of getting into the territory, first of all, for biodiversity protection, with implementing a national strategy to protect that. That can be the main reason for the tool. But we have partners that work in that area. But what's original that parks can make available through this tool is to accompany private owners and to be the environmental guarantee for the owner who needs advice in terms of management and so forth. So it makes it possible to stabilize and frame in that type of approach. Now, one added value is the long-lastingness of restoration actions for natural media, especially on private land. When there is a public investment, for example, that's implemented in the park on private or land, you can ensure that that investment is controlled over the middle term or the long term. So after a few years, if there's a change in ownership and there have been investments made, that can be called into question because there's a change of ownership. And we'll have an example of that a bit later. So if I summarize, you have a natural regional park that's quite great, and a town, a lot of people involved in the various towns involved, and you're mobilizing real environmental obligations at the service mainly of a biodiversity strategy in the framework of your regional national park. And that strategy is generally defined in the charter, indeed. That's a good transition. That's a good segue. And the idea is to explain what's the content of your charter. Do you have the term obligation in that charter? And what chapter are the obligations in? Well, we're in between 2 charters. The first goes back from 2009, but now we're currently reviewing that. If everything goes well, it'll be approved in the next few months. In the first generation of the charter, the OREs, it didn't exist when it was drafted at the time, but we used it to include them in actions, i.e. preservation and deriving value from natural areas. So there was Natura 2000, but in this new charter, which It's the roadmap for the territory over a 15-year period. So it commits the only partners of the territory. It's not only the roadmap for the park, but it's the actual roadmap for the territory. So the term ORE appears in 3 entries. And the ambition on the part of the park is to be responsible for these natural resources, and that comes into all the strategy of conservation. So the term ORE appears in the actual application of protected areas. But we also have it as a tool in green and blue. There are several tools that have been mobilized, both farming tools and real estate, which appear very clearly. And the last indication of the Charter is everything having to do with biodiversity in the forest. So it makes it possible for us to cover all possible areas of protection, agricultural, forest, and so forth, with that mobilization in that way. Thank you. Fantastic. If I try to summarize, we have a natural regional park, which is a group of communities, and they take care of a natural regional space which is quite extensive. And in the framework of SPARC, the strategy over 15 years, which has been described in a charter, and based on the strategy turning around OREs, and it is a tool. The OREs are tools that can be mobilized on a case-by-case basis. So we will have a concrete example when we get back to the panel discussion. So let's carry on about the feedback of we're going to call that FCEN as well. That's the acronym in French. So I'm going to hand over to Fabrice Normand. Hi, Fabrice. Hi. You are director of the Natural Conservation Spaces of the Pays-de-la-Loire. Director of so it is a federation. And I'm going to ask you the question. Could you define what that conservation activity is, and could you respond on the usage and obligations with respect to the environment of these areas? And perhaps I think it would be good if we could see the slides as well. Thank you. This conservatory are associations from their 1901 associations, or 9, I'm not sure of the actual year for Alsace and Lorraine, but there are 23 conservatories in the department, and there's a certain number of territories, higher Savoie, lower Savoie, Ariège. There are other conservatories that are between departments, and that date back to 2015, and regional conservatories on other administrative areas, which is the case of the one that I represent from the Pays-de-la-Loire. So these natural spaces have been set up based on 1966 for the oldest among them. So they're mainly in the east of France, in Lorraine and Alsace and PACA. And they come of various different origins, in fact. Now, the one from the Pays-de-la-Loire is quite recent because they'll be 10 years old this year. And the latest one is in the Paris area, and another one in Guyane, and probably soon in Guadeloupe we'll have one too. But it's mainly in metropolitan France. But there is one in Guyane. Amongst what's in our DNA, since 1976 was the year of the law for protecting nature was passed, with the conservation policies for control. So there's protected spaces and so forth that were defined. And it was a year after that 75 law that we created the Conservatory for the coastal areas, which was a public area to protect real estate and to reduce the interactions with that coastal area from people and associations. I've said, well, that's all very well and good, but we need a tool for the coastline because it is under threat, and it still is for various reasons. So what's going on for the rest of the French countryside? The physical people, town. So we need to have something equivalent in these areas. And the government didn't take care of that. So we think we have to structure this. So we're going to be structuring this. Now, in terms of the classical protection of nature, very quickly, we wanted to bring this policy of controlling real estate and its usage. It was really important to speak out the actual terms that are used, because something like 200,000 hectares managed by that in France. I think less than 10% of that area are the actual owned by the organizations. In all other cases, there are various types of environmental obligations. So we can control real estate and usage. So what about real estate usage? Well, the tools that we have for that are acquisitions by the conservatory, in fact. And since last November, we have a foundation which is Espace Naturel de France, which already owns land that will be land of other, or owners of other pieces of land. But this is to get back to the question that was asked earlier, with the non-militant expression. We created this space, this area of natural spaces. We wanted that real estate action to take place in the framework of public policy, that it would not be carried by associations who have their interest in a role to play in civil society, who will perhaps be bringing lawsuits in cases where that is necessary. But it's not in the DNA. We are more in a posture of dealing with a site-by-site approach, depending on local data, agricultural policies, hunting policies, to work with communities and owners and farmers and hunters and other users of these areas in terms of conservation of nature. So you have a toolbox.
En introduction d'ailleurs, c'est plein d'outils.
So there are plenty of tools in your toolbox, and some of those also include this conservation easement, and you have a few figures over here concerning what our conservation easements are and what's been signed by the Conservatory of Natural Spaces, and it's nearly 2,000 hectares in France. I can't find the number of hectares. Oh, they're about 65. So this is, you add that to the 130 as announced by the ministry. So 1 in 2 of these conservation servitudes is actually signed, easements has been signed by those who look after these natural parks and spaces. 130 was in 2023. But still it's very relevant. I work with the conservatory, so we had 16 that were signed in 2023, and they're a big player. They're big players here. Yes, as far as the Pays-de-la-Loire is concerned, we have signed 3. We've signed 3 of these easements in 3 of these departments, like you see over here, and each time it represents 25 to 40 hectares. You were talking about mobilizing certain land tools, so that'll be part of the strategy adopted by the conservatory. Yeah, I didn't mention it to you, but the conservatories are actually certified organisms, and that is according to the Environmental Code N 414, and it has to be done by the region and by the state on the basis of a 5-year action plan. So it's a bit like what you have for the protection of your parks, and which was a lighter version. It's likely to be over a 10-year period, and we've determined our goals. And for the conservatory in the Pays-de-la-Loire, it would be 1,000 hectares that would be preserved between now and 2025-27. We've reached 500, so 100 hectares are part of this easement servitude. So it's a very useful tool for us. Now, why are conservatories using these tools? I mentioned to you earlier that thanks to all the tools we've mobilized, we also have management conventions or agreements. It doesn't really exist in law. It's just handled by the general law concerning contracts. It's not a real contract, and it's related to the person who signs. So what happens when this person dies, or when they sell the the asset, well, then it's null and void. So when this conservation easement was brought in, we found that we could apply it to this management convention, and which would be perhaps a little more solid by the baillon footique. So that's over 99 years that you have a hold over the land, and after that it's no longer yours. But that would also be what we call a real law. Right. Well, thanks to this system, we can now really make this management convention something real. It'll be signed by a notary, and so obligations will be attached to the estate and not to the deed holder. And what's more, the owner can keep the use of it. It all depends on what the owner wishes to do. Yes, of course, and there's another interesting case concerning the use of these conservation easements. In the Pays-de-la-Loire, that's the west of France, and it's a nice flat area, lots of plains, and there are, it represents less than 10%, and there's not much of mountainous area. So this is the reason why biodiversity tools are used all the time. And that's why, particularly for breeding, for Christine and Marie-Hélène, it's for all the wetlands. The conservatory can't really buy it because they don't have the means, and it's also because they can't buy all these farms completely because it's too expensive. So we do it with some of the cases, but now we have a case which helps them to insert in their agricultural practices certain serious conservation easements that have been signed in front of the notary over a wider scale of land as opposed to what we have today in France. Normally you just buy small plots of land, but these are particular deeds, proprietary deeds that you can't buy for the reasons I had mentioned. So bocage, as you can see, in all national strategies for protection of nature are part and parcel of it. It's in the forest area, mountainous area, etc. So in case you don't know what the bocage is, it's all the natural barriers that we have, like hedges, like trees, like the growth of natural plants, etc. Yes. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for your feedback. That was very interesting, and I'm trying to sum it up. So a conservatory is a sort of association in private law, and the main aim is to protect natural parks, and which has several tools available to it, which it uses on the basis of the requirements. So as far as you're concerned, it helps you to mobilize in order to cover any holes or any loopholes, and also to set up partnerships, because this is a voluntary agreement. There's no enforcement as such. It's a partnership. It's all voluntary. And that's why so many contracts are being signed with farmers. Now, talking of partnership and agriculture, let's just end off with Marie-Hélène and Christian Tanguy. Well, good morning. We are delighted to have you here with us. Well, give us a presentation of your farm and of all that you're doing. Take us over there so that we can understand it. I know you've got photos. And once you've shown us your photos, tell us why you signed this easement, this conservation easement. Tell us about what the contents are. Tell us exactly what it's all about. Because you signed it with the Conservation, Conservatoire naturel des espaces. Why did you sign it? Yes, good morning, everyone. My name is Christian Tanguy. So we have a farm in the Vendée area, in the Bocage, and the Vendée is really La Roche-Orient, that area. And this area in the past was essentially for breeding, and it was extremely harmonious and very few forests and woodland. It was the last department to be reforested. However, we have quite a few, a lot of marshy lands. I'm sure that the hunters know all about it. So we went and started living there, and we had just the normal sort of agriculture. You know, we had cows. We both have had training in this field. I'm from Brittany, so Brittany, as you understand, we are all quite. We are diehards when it comes to agriculture. So when it came to corn and maize and all that kind of treatment, we were really into artichokes and things like that. As you know, I grew up with all that. And then this all became a part of the past. You were talking about all the green lichen and so on. My beaches used to be clean, and now they're all green. They're grown over by these weeds. So our approach initially was to do away with this large-scale cultivation and to do away with what they're doing now, ravaging the countryside, and then we converted our farm now to organic farming, and that was a major change in our habits. We're very happy with it, and now our children have taken over. There's a nice photo at the back there, which would be your farm with the bocage. The bocage are the trees growing there. And what's more, we are right on the borderland of this wooded area, and that's very exceptional in the Vendée. And this is called the Bois de la Moine and Bois de Moine and Bois de la Graffe. It's those woods. We are separated by this little river or torrent. So it's a very forested area. It's a wetland, and it's also for agriculture. We have 4 different kinds of soil over a small area. Not very easy to handle, but from a purely environment protection point of view, it's very interesting. So you grow, and you also have permanent pastures, yes, or prairies. So we have a mixture in our habits of oats, peas, wheat, and other cereals. So now tell us about your easement. Conservation easement. Well, we have a neighbor who's a naturalist and who's quite a militant, and he asked us, like, what on earth are you doing here? Why do you let the cows just cross this little brook over there? Yeah, you know. So initially we thought, what on earth is he all about? You know, he's just one of those hippies and laid-back guys, and I'm not going to get involved in it, because between a naturalist and a farmer, there's a world of different approaches. Because if I put a wiring to protect my cows from crossing the brook, that would mean that I wouldn't be able to trim under the wire. But we kept listening to him, and we discovered that our farm was really quite rich. It had a lot in it, so be it dragonflies, plants, or frogs and all those species, we had plenty, and so we're discovering all that. And now I tell him, the more I know about what's on my land, the more I wish to protect it. It was not in our former culture, in the way we were educated in our agricultural studies. We never learnt about all that, because these schools didn't really take that into account. Our professors and teachers didn't inculcate this into us. So there you go. And so tell us about your conservation easement. Well, now we're getting to retirement age, and we can feel it, and it's been nearly 25 years of protection. So that means our entire farm could now go back to normal farming with all those huge implements and so on, but we can't do that. We can't do that. It just seems impossible to us. And my first reaction now would be, how am I to protect my farm from being ravaged by all that? So I got in touch with another organization which helps you to protect smaller surfaces. Well, we had 3 kinds of species. There was a water rat, there was a species, and there was also a dragonfly of a certain kind that needed protection. So actually there's a kind of lotus also that grows in our marshy areas. Lots and lots of frog varieties. So we just felt that we could now perhaps just leave all this and retire. Now, before we had these huge divisions of farms, we maintained ours at 4 to 5 hectares, so therefore you can have methane. Now, to answer the hunter in the field, in this assembly, yeah, hi. Yeah, hi. We can't hear the hunter. Of course, I have hunters who are friends of mine. We have all sorts of hunters looking for images and trying to get a promotion for themselves, and others who have guns. We are quite open to all these hunting activities. There's no problem, and it all depends on the relationship you have between farmers and hunters. There are some hunters who are quite crazy, but you've got naturalists also who are quite crazy. So that's no issue. It's a non-issue for us. Very often these hunters provide me with data concerning natural conservation of nature. Let's not forget that they're also there to protect nature. So now to get back to the famous French ORE, or conservation easement. So I'm part of the directors board of the LPO in Vendée. And since I was on the board, I didn't really wish to lose my label of organic farming. Then I read an article in our local magazine called Village Magazine. So it was in Normandy. Ah, there he is, the representative. Now, over there, they had signed quite a few of these conservation easements contracts. So I got in touch with him, and he said, it's the best possible thing that could ever happen. He'd done that with the Seine. We didn't know each other at the time, so I got in touch with the Seine. Yes, we'll talk about it right after, but I have a question for both of you prior to that. I heard several of your interviews, and each time you have said that when you signed this conservation easement, which is also a question of letting the right run with the land, what do you understand by that? Let me answer that question. Well, I set up my farm, and I was a farmer for over 40 years. And this person with whom we worked, Maya, in fact, her name was, for 40 years she was breeding animals, and we were very aware of all the living beings around us. So we had associations working in organic farming. We saw the flora, the fauna developing. So it's a living habitat which keeps changing and developing. And we loved it. We loved what we were doing. And for me, the conservation easement was the ultimate goal of everything we were doing. And I really felt that I was giving a certain status to my land so that it maintains its potential and that the fertility of soils be maintained. I'll go even further. I feel that now the earth can defend itself because it has a legal status. And this goes way beyond us, we owners or landlords. The land as such, the earth, is a living being which will continue. and it will not stop in its progress. And given that people have greedy eyes on the earth, who are absolutely pillaging the earth, because that's what it is, this ORE in French, or this conservation easement, is a perfect tool. It just makes sure that the earth, this planet, stays alive and lives for a long time. So if I sum up with you have planted trees and hedges, your bocages right through, and your signing this conservation easement seemed to be the final stage of all that you'd been doing. And besides, you wish to keep using this land, because in this handing over, there was also this environmental value, and it was also the idea of sharing it with others, whoever else would take it over. Well, we've shared with our children. We have it's not as easy as all that for them to understand and to factor in this naturalist policy, because they have all the problems of actually setting up shop as a farm, as farmers. But they feel the responsibility and all that they can do with it. It'll certainly add to them and their knowledge and their, they haven't understood everything. So you've said that you are owners and you've signed up with the conservatory. Now, there are other photos also that perhaps we could look at. Maybe we can look at them a little later. So now let's get on to the second panel, and there should be an exchange with Fabrice Normand in order to talk about this conservation easement in detail. Tell us exactly how it happened and how did you get in touch with them? And once this contact was taken, what were the steps? How long did it take? And I believe that you signed it in the presence of a notary. Tell us, Fabrice Normand, please tell us, and then when you feel that it's the right thing to do, just come in and speak about it. And then we'll also talk about the content and as well as the obligations that all that you're supposed to do. Yes, Fabrice? Well, Christian said quite a lot. Well, it's true. You had thought about of using a kind of prefectural decree to protect your biotope and so on. And you had talked about public authorities for the protection of birds. And I understood that there was going to be 3 years of hard work to try and sign up for this protective measure. And we didn't really have time. We wanted to do it really very quickly. So Christine and Marie-Hélène got in touch with us. They sent us an email. And they said that we read an article in Village magazine with a landowner who had committed himself, I think one of the first few, concerning this conservation easement with the Conservatory of Normandy. So we called him and he said, this is what we should do. And they said, ring up the Conservatory of Natural Areas. And that's what we did. And I think we fixed an appointment. I came to see you fairly soon. We met maybe 2 or 3 times, not many more times than that. And Christian and Marie-Hélène were very clear about what they wanted to do. And there was an inventory done of all that was to be protected, the natural prairies, the sources of the river, it's called La Bérion, etc., all the marshes that existed on their land. And besides, you'd already adopted certain conservation methods, for instance, the mégaphore, the protection. It's called mégaphorbier. What is forbier? It just means vegetation with large leaves. So all the species which are rather exuberant that you see along waterways, because it's luxuriant growth of trees and plantations and so on, and that's where you see a lot of our insect friends come in. So they did that during the right season, and they put a wire along the brook so that your cattle wouldn't go across and go into this mega fourbière to prevent them from grazing there. Yes, that's to enable the vegetation to keep growing and also to have all the species that come in 10 years. And now, of course, it's full of life. In the last 10 years, we can see it's really luxuriant and full of life. So we came to an agreement very quickly, and we used the typical project that was developed by the Fédération of Natural Spaces Conservatory. We shared it with the Credo and the Chamber of Notaries, the Institution of Notaries. So we went and spoke to our notary, who signed this conservation easement for the first time in his life. Yes, and I could see that he was extremely involved, very engaged, very happy to be doing that, to discover all this. And right after this signature, we had a little party with Christian and Marie-Hélène, and even the notary came with his children. He was so happy to have signed it. How long did the whole process take? 3 or 4 months. But you'd already made a lot of progress. Yes, because our partners here, the signatories, were very clear about what they wanted to do, and the inventory was done, both concerning the vegetation and the other species. And we had the help of the naturalists, LPO, and the hunters, because we have hunter friends around. So we had all the rudimentaries, if you like, to sign our agreement. Now, concerning the APB, here is a conservation easement. It's nice and simple. It's just a deed, a notarial deed. It's very simple, and I think it was just brilliant. Of course, you have to find the notary who agrees with you. And that's also very important, a very important tool, plus the association that you've selected. Or you go through a local municipality, a local government. And this happens once you know what you want, because as a landlord, you must know what you want. So if you're lucky enough to own land, because that's also luck, be it farming land or just areas around us, land around us, they're completely parceled off. We were lucky that we were able to buy up all the farms around us, because most of the owners were getting old. And in organic farming, if you really wish to continue, you must really have complete hold over your estate, your real estate. Well, that brings me to the content of your conservation easement. Just a reaction to what Fabrice said. You were talking about a very typical deed. So, in fact, it's a contract, a blank contract that you fill in, right? And you can put what you like in it, as we said. If it's to protect a tree or several hectares, you specify what you wish to do. You put in your easement. Apart from that, you can have obligations that could cover the entire land. For instance, do not build, and then have other obligations or easements depending on the various plots or parcels of land to adapt to this conservation. So you have a time and space modulation, plus you don't just sign a single easement, conservation easement for a bit of land. You can do it for the rest. It's very simple. Let's just talk about the commitments or the obligations of all sides. Now, here you have all the bullet points concerning the responsibility and liability of the landlords and also of the conservatory. Christian? Should I read them out to you? Yes, please do that. Now, firstly, it's to authorize access to the conservatory, the FCEN. That's not so easy because it's your land. Yes, in our farms, we don't like people sneaking around, and we say this is private property. You know that issue that we have. But we were quite the opposite. We said, we don't know much. It's really not part of our training, that's for sure. You know, I was just trained to be a farmer and it was all focused on that. I think today the schools are doing a better job. And we immediately realized that it was important to have outsiders who come in and give us advice, and also scientists, not just X, Y, or Z. So in our conservation easement, we opened up to researchers, to schools, to educational organizations, anyone who would help us protect our habitat. So you give them access to the CN, you give them access to your land, because normally you can refuse it. And this access is based on a common agreement, a joint agreement. Yes, that's right. So we just walk around, we chat, and it's very open. When we talk to friends who wish to sign a conservation easement, they ask, what do you mean people just come into your on your land? And I said, yes. It's like when you invite people home to visit your house, come and see my house. You're really happy, especially since you know the wealth that you possess. When you know how wonderful your habitat is, you wish to share it. Why would you hide it? No, we're extremely open. And you have complete control, right? You check this access. And I think there are certain other obligations. I'll read them out to you and you can elaborate. And so maintain an extensive farming management by cutting and prairie, not build, protect our permanent prairies, hedges of marshes, trees, isolated trees and woods, not introduce any exotic species, and also have a band, or rather a ribbon of land which would be for non-intervention along the Yonne River. Now let's talk about the trees, the hedges, our boucage. That's something that really motivates us. We planted a lot and I'm still planting, and my aim is to have 40 trees per year that I plant. We're not urbanites, so we work directly with nature, and it's amazing to see the results, and you can really enjoy yourself. I'm eco-anxious, and so I plant, and I freak out when I'm planting my trees. I love it. So trees and hedges are a must. They're indispensable in terms of biodiversity, for gaining in water supply and water protection and having more minerals, etc. in the water. Thank you very much. Now let's talk about the Conservatoire d'espace naturel, because as you said, there are certain reciprocal obligations. Maybe you could tell us about one of them?
Éventuellement, on parle, apporter son expertise, je pense.
We're talking about having a management plan and updating such plan. Well, in fact, it's a document for planning purposes to put together a diagnosis, both ecological and social, economic, of usages, to try to have some kind of a summary of what's going on the site, what's at stake in the way the ecosystem works. This is an approach that we're implementing on all sites managed by the Conservatory, whether they're in the framework of ORE or not. We're doing it also in owned lands which we are entrusted the management of. So we're trying to be objective over 6, 8, 10 years. And we list the management actions and restoration actions to be implemented. That could include studies, follow-up acquisitions, and learning new things about the biodiversity on the site. It could include restoration activities. Christo and Marie-Hélène have an approach that is going to be starting to change the course of the river to enable the saving small buildings. And management actions in, for example, hedgerows or riverbanks. So Lisa and Kevin and Marie-Hélène's Christian are running the farm still. So the pastures are part of conservation. And actions that are under discussion with owners for welcoming the public, which is already the case before. They are actually a part of the accueil présent, they have the people can actually stay in housing on the farm if they want, and so to enable them to visit the area. In other cases, I'm not really open to having the land being open to everybody, but so if we summarize, we have a contract that you discussed, you've talked it over amongst yourselves, and everybody sets their limits. The co-contractor, the conservatory, actually has their obligations as well. So you set those limits as you wish. Yeah, and that's important. The contract to guarantee the robustness in the future, so that it can't be called into question in 30 or 40 years when the new owner comes on and says it's imbalanced. Well, as an owner, I have tons of obligations to do or not to do, and the legal entity that I have in front of me, we have to put content in there and provide expertise and do a management program and restoration and so forth. And our colleagues that we had to convince to do an ORE, the question was also, my land is going to lose value. And what we say is we don't know. We think it's going to give value to the land. It seems that you benefited from a tax exemption, right? Maybe we could talk about that when we move on to PNR. We asked the town hall, which accepted. So there was a deliberation whether you were due to the real estate tax or was due or not. So these are major discussions that we've had with the SEN. When we're in a farming area, they want to switch to RE, there are constraints. We're committing to something. And we thought that exemption was not enough. It's almost the same constraints as Natura 2000. So the idea was to provide MAE type aid that others have, those that are in, wetlands or whatever. And that could be for the farming world as well. Because in addition, it encourages farmers to switch over to ORE. So there's an economic difficulty that could perhaps be surmounted with some kind of help of that type. Thank you so much for this exchange. And for this wonderful example of an application of an ORE. I think we're going to have a Q&A a bit later on. I could have gone on for another hour, but we're going to move on to another example in the natural regional park in the Pyrenees with Yannick Barascud. You've also signed ORE obligations. I suggest that we choose one of those and explain perhaps what you've done with that. Well, we talked about appropriation as a way of having a long-lasting public investment on private property. So I'm going to present that. And our entry into this area was a way for ORE to guarantee human investment in this territory. We had two people that came to see us because they spent their lives managing their areas and biodiversity and so forth, and they didn't want that energy to be called into question by a change of ownership. So they wanted to use the park to guarantee that. So that's a reality. Yes, if we hadn't had the tool, it wouldn't have been as easy. And it mobilizes citizen mobility. Yeah. Now, if we get back to the example that I've chosen, so these are the two other ones that I'm speaking about with the owners that came to us. It's this one, isn't it? No, it's the one with the flowers. So this is a woman, organic farmer. A very strong appropriation of biodiversity. Sometimes a bit of a militant. And there was no succession possible, so she wanted to have someone to take over her property, including the buildings, and continue everything she's started and wants to keep conserving in the future. And you have a second one. Now this one is the one where we intervened with public financing. So in this one, we did some restoration of hedgerows. So we're the owner here is an elderly farmer, and we don't know what's going to happen later on. But we are currently managing various Apteta. It requires a specific architecture because he's offering there's dead wood, there are holes, and there are nesting areas, in fact, for biodiversity of interest. There can be insects and bats and so forth, and a signature for the beautiful landscape. Here we have very characteristic hedgerows, because there's an agricultural management of those hedgerows that's quite specific. Some are quite high, others are low. So it gives a whole landscape signature in this area, which is quite unique. So this was a hedgerow that was cut recently. So they were kind of losing a bit of their appearance of a local hedgerow, and we had to get back to work on this. So the current farmer couldn't stand it. Because it required a technique, he had to get back up in trees, and he couldn't do that. So he had to call on someone to do that could use the tools and could climb up the tree to do the work. So they did that restoration. It was an investment that was via our restoration contracts and financed by the region and by Europe. And so what we were saying is that maybe he accepted that we could do that on his premises, and it's quite exemplary under conditions that were done. Maybe the next owner will change that. Maybe 15,000 euros were invested, which would be a useless investment otherwise. So the tool was the third request, and the first two, I went to Normandy to see how it was done, and we were a bit more at ease because we could see what we could put in there and so forth. So the tool you're speaking about is based on 14 lines. That's kind of the strength of the tool. There's so little description that you can kind of put in there what you want. So we chose, with the agreement of the owner, to talk about keeping the buildings, organizing the hedgerows. So this is kind of the signature here that you see of the local countryside. So this is an inheritance of the agricultural presence in this area, which is heritage, That's what we're seeing today. Several hundred years of human investment. And you have to maintain that. Things collapse. And there's a different management of various parcels. So it goes beyond just biodiversity. There's also a whole cultural and traditional resources. You can see the balance between obligations of the private owner and obligations on the side of the park. In terms of the private owners, we're talking about access to private parcels by agents of the park. So we may allow them to commit to the non-return of parcels, not using any type of herbicide or pesticide. and about how to that they would be maintained in agricultural status. And our commitment on our side was to simulate financial tools in relationship with that. We were talking about MAEs, which made it possible for us to go to the farmer and propose environmental measures, a voluntary contract between the farmer and the ecology minister, so that would not go through the park. You need a framework account upstream, and that's what we set up on our side to make some farmers to commit to the contract. And they're committing because they have, in terms of biodiversity and flora and fauna and so forth. So we have an example of RAE, which is mobilized over a long haul. We have financing for engineering on the previous example that was quite interesting. Let's move on to the conclusive step of this panel discussion. So first of all, I'd like to hand over to Pascal Bargiarelli for 2 minutes only, because we're starting to be a bit late in our planning, just so to give us a quick overview of possible international, and then we have INRAE who will be speaking, present his research project. So I'll invite him to come up and take a mic. And Pascal Bargiarelli, 2 minutes, and the challenge there is significant. In the news these days about OREs, as this is a case about national strategy for a protected area. It's L110.4 of the Environmental Code, which gives an objective of 30% of French oil land areas are to be protected by 2030 and 10% under strong protection. There's a decree for application of this law published in April 22, which says that territories supporting OLE can be described as strong protection areas, and that's a recognition that's only voluntary at the request of the owner, which makes it possible for RREs to contribute to national efforts in terms of protection of biodiversity. So there are various criteria for that. First of all, it's a recognition on case-by-case basis. You have to have important ecological questions involved. Now, for this to be recognized as a strong protection area, there has to be tools for that protection. And either you have human activities that generate pressure, or you do implement pressure to have reduced significantly or eliminated certain types of situations which are, and also the length of time can be quite long. So these are measures to reduce that pressure. So about what's new, you can have the first OREs that are actually under protection. We're happy that that's coming online. Now, this has to go through the regional management of the ministry. So there's a technical instruction or instructions that are ongoing to see how it works concretely. Once you've got that, you can insist on the OREs, communicate on them, and we hope, I'm not the one that decides, but you could have a Secretary of State to come and look at the first ORE. That would be pretty effective. So the idea is to integrate OREs that give the most significant levels of protection, to integrate them in protected areas. That's the first example of a way of leveraging. But now, what about OREs under various skies? This is a tool that's given to private players, which can use them, and it does give us some difficulties, in fact. So in this respect, we have prospects for development with strong protection areas, but there's clearly an issue from the point of view of studies. We need to study the tool to be able to analyze it properly and to propose ways forward. And that's interesting because in parallel with everything that's going on, We have a research project with the INRAE about real environmental obligations, the OREs, which will make it possible for us to have a little idea. I'm going to call Mr. Romain Melot and Mr. Guillaume Pain. I'd like to invite you to come up or grab a mic so they can give us some details about their research program. Maybe we could give them a microphone to each. Take 5 minutes so that you can present that research project. After we'll move on to the Q&A, and we'll be finished at 1:15, so we don't have much time. So the floor is yours. Okay, briefly, let's say a word about a research project that's ongoing. When we had exchanged with Arnaud in preparing the journey you were solicited, really, because there's no results to be presenting to you. It's kind of frustrating, but we're just presenting the approach, generally. So to do that, I'm going to pass over to Renaud and then to Guillaume Pain to talk about agroecology. And we are very interested in this double way of looking at things, as an ecologist and otherwise, to look at the implementation of the tool. What we saw in guise of introduction at the beginning of the session is that a certain amount of data, a certain amount of figures, and the information that we have on the national level gives us some quantitative indications about the way the tool is ramping up, but not much in-depth information about the motivations of owners and practices for negotiating contracts. We would like to do this so very quickly. We've exchanged with you guys, and thanks for the support. And we're preparing 2 questionnaires, both intended for contractors and owners, who would be a small team. Camille went to see the farm of Mr. and Mrs. Tanguy. And the idea, very quickly, insofar as contractors are concerned, we've seen in the panel discussion, we had a certain idea of the way in which we could be part of their strategies for general action. Some organizations, like they said, can have players. There's very small companies. There's smaller collective associations that amounts at this amount of. But anyway, might make it possible to get a little bit of legal expertise as well. If we're looking at the small organizations we're interested in, as it stands today, we went over them yesterday with about 15 interviews we had in that respect. And then on the owner side, as a sociologist, the idea is to see all of the motivations there might be with respect to this kind of project. So at one time, do we intervene? Was it at what level? Was it proactive, or was it received from the organizations themselves? And how do we resituate those in the framework of their own worldwide strategy, if it's supposed to be executed and linked to the functioning of the group? And so one important bit of information is that about content and commitments and obligations. There's a very strong variability, and that's what's good about the flexibility of the tool. So it's a good thing to run some queries. So what we do as well is share with people about this project. People who work with you exclusively in other countries. Now, I also put my email, so if you have owners that are interested, you can certainly contact me if you want to change your exchange. And I will now pass the mic on to Guillaume. And he has some issues with what this type of contract is going to be having on controlling ecology. So a bit of additional information. One important distinction, we are on an exploratory mission. It's being developed a lot, and the idea here is in the 2 years we have had is to run inquiries, to raise questions, to better understand what we're doing with the contractors and the different tools. So that's why we don't have any data, but it's more reasonable than wanting to have data right away, because the objective for us is to raise the right questions. Even all of the questions, don't forget they've been shared with us, because in addition we're going to be extending that, because we're in the Loire region, in the major west area with Camille and Alicia, and we're going to be extending that next year because it's a consortium. So we're working with other people, at least researching colleagues from Dijon and also from the south of France. And we're continuing to explore those. So anyway, send us all the information or questions you like from an ecological point of view, above and beyond the actual knowledge about the ecology science as such. What I'm interested more in, we've been thinking about things regionally or interregionally and biodiversity and various scientific approaches. So what I see as being interesting in regions such as ours is to work, and I work in a farming school, an agriculture school, and just to make sure that we're aware of the advantages of farming in our area and what the benefits are. So you have the Territorial, which is the environmental agency in that region. That's who we work with. And they spoke about the possibility of mobilizing OREs in the national strategy of protected areas. And I thought that was a really interesting idea, but as well, it raises a lot of questions, because we see clearly that the motivation of owners are broadly differing in sensitive areas, because it can be scientific. And in many cases, there's a strong attachment about the tree, which doesn't necessarily correspond to biodiversity for the site. So it raises questions from an ecological point of view, and the effective contribution that this object, this tool, can have on actual protection, the issues that are at stake in terms of the national heritage of the region. So that's why we have to see with the SEN, that's the organization, the real estate policy, so we can orientate the OREs. There's a lot of things at stake there. So how can we accompany them and accompany owners to protect what they want to protect, but by kind of running things at the same time, because there are repercussions from the regional. Thank you so much for that study. Don't hesitate to get into contact with them. The more material we have to study, the more the conclusive the studies will be. Let's move on right away to the Q&A session. We have about a quarter of an hour for that. And I hope, there are a lot of hands being raised. I know there's tons of questions, so we're breathlessly waiting for your questions. 15 minutes. In the framework of OREs, and it's only normal, we talked about the relationship between owners, the territories, and accompanying associations or groups. So we forgot about the farmers. I'd like to know if you have many examples of farmers who accept, being farmers, onto the fermage status, to accept that an owner might want to impose upon the land that they farm. And have you succeeded in that approach? I worked on OREs with the Seine-Maritime region. We created several OREs in several areas, including in shared communal land, the town land. But in the fermage status could be an obstacle, because the farmer has to accept the rules that will be applied by the ORE. Who wants to answer that very interesting question? Fabrice. We have 3 OREs that we signed off. There are 2 where the owner is still the farmer, so there's no question there. But Marie-Hélène's question, it stays in the family. It's a family affair, but we're already in the case where they're still owners, but they've let their children take over. But at the time when we wrote the ORE, when we met, we observed that you hadn't actually signed a lease because it was in the family with Kevin and Elisa. And so what we suggested to invite you to draft a special ORE lease with the easement provisions. So in the ORE, as we've seen, you can write what you want, except we can't regulate hunting, especially if it already exists. However, but you need the agreement of the people that are taking over the lease. But in the rural area, there's a list of 12 or 16 items. So we tried for each commitment that you saw earlier in OREs to find correspondences to match those with those 16 items that are in the list. So it's pretty easy to do in some cases, but in other cases where there's a farmer who has a lease with no environmental clause, but clauses that are different from the OREs, we have to either succeed in convincing the guy or we don't do an ORE. Marie-Hélène? Yeah, it's true. It's complicated because the person who's setting up, even if my daughter worked for 6 years with me before she set up, it's a whole path. And we have a neighbor who also wants to sign an ORE, and that's the difficulty. He's handed this over to a member of the family who doesn't necessarily want to sign. Well, that's our job, is to try to move forward. And we can see that we're discussing things, which is very important. Exchanging is all important. Would you like to add something? Yes, we can go either, especially when you're going further. There are French departments where we're seeking out areas that we can protect. In La Vendée, for example, they asked us to come in and to produce an ONS, sensitive natural areas, ONS in French. There are a lot of OREs, but our children are kind of shaky about wanting to have them be ONS, because we brought in some parcels we were not able to plow anymore. Thank you. Perhaps we could take other questions?
Oui, bonjour.
Yes, good morning. I'm from the Foundation for the Preservation of Nature, so I'm asking the same question that was just asked, and it's about what happens after you've signed up this easement. What happens? Did you have any concrete examples? A land that is signed up a conservation easement, was it sold? And does the value, the land value, even if in terms of biodiversity it's greater, but from this simple commercial value, market value, has it had an impact? So I want to know this from my personal and professional point of view. Personally, because I know a landowner who has children and who wouldn't like to use this ORE because he feels that he will lose out monetarily and also professionally, because there was another farmer in the Tarn area who signed up one of these convention easements and who can't find anyone to buy it from him. So he wants to sell his farm to the foundation now, because he knows that we'll be able to manage it as we can with someone we just rent it out to. Thank you. Impact, Marie-Hélène. Well, these are genuine issues, but you know, we've finished off with one cycle of history and this is a new era that's starting. So preservation or conservation is all about the future now. That's what I think. Yes, Pascal. Unfortunately, we don't know if any land was sold, land on which we had signed these conservation easements, so I can't answer your question. But maybe with the cases of Urine Drive, we could, And how about the conservatories? Well, in the Pays-de-la-Loire we don't have. I don't know if you've had any in the Federation. No. Well, all of us are asking these questions as signatories or... because there must be some jurisprudence. We would like to see what would happen. We've talked about it with the first generation, and we are with people like Christian, like this couple, who are voluntarily signing up. They're like us. But when the land changes hands, we'll have to see what happens. And we would need 2 or 3 or 4 cases to see what happens, if it's going to be conflictual or not, what justice is going to say about it, etc. Well, we do hope that we won't have the first few issues, quite honestly. Yes, so far we're just living a honeymoon, aren't we, of conservation easements. No, but you shouldn't get too worried, really. I don't think so. This land which is now submitted to conservation easement will not be used up for huge, large-scale farming. But personally, I feel that the ecological and diversity issues are so great that we have to do something about it. If we landowners, farmers, if we who belong to the land, if we can't do this to protect this biodiversity, then forget it. Let me remind you that 90% of the insects have disappeared and 1/3 of all the passerine birds. And there's also a million kilometers of hedges that are being swallowed up by France. So if we can, contribute, do our little bit, if we can contribute, we must, because every drop makes an ocean. We are lucky we have this tool. And this ORE is not to be criticized. It's a piece of luck that we've got it, And I'd like to thank all of you who worked on this provision. Yes? Next question.
Answer from the US that we know that the land around the ORE usually increases in value. So, just something to add.
Merci pour cette précision. On avait une autre question. Vous vouliez rajouter quelque chose, c'est ça?
Did you wish to say something else? Well, I was just given the microphone, so I don't know if I want to talk or not. No, all right. Yeah, go ahead and ask your question. Thank you. Thanks very much for this discussion. It was great. I'm Delphine Dupeux, and I work for the European Organization for Landowners. So we've been following up on this for a long time, and we were precursors concerning private land conservation. And I have a lot of questions for this couple over here, but I think it's done now. Now, about transmission or handing down, I think we're on the right path. What's important is that you have to educate the coming generations and have educational tools or instructive tools concerning these conservation easements. Very often it creates problems within the family, and that's what we have to work on. We work a lot on these issues, so perhaps we could join forces, I would just say that life is a great project, and then thanks to this networking, we will have a greater momentum. I see this all through. We see that with the private landowners. If the neighbor does something interesting and if he feels that it's really going to work, then it works. It's very important that there be this kind of networking, and that's what we work on. So this is a message I'm delivering. And then maybe another question about how long the financing or the funding will go on, because that matters, because if it's the public authorities behind it, you never know, they might change their mind, and that keeps varied. So private landowners worry about that. Will they continue working in maintaining this natural wealth that they have or not? Also, question about global warming. What happens if all these ecosystems disappear? Have you made any provisions for that? That's a big issue, right? And then another question concerning the monitoring. Do we know how efficient these measures are? It's important to know if there's a real contribution towards increase in biodiversity. It depends on the quality of your conservation easement. This issue has really come up in the USA. Has it really had any genuine impact on biodiversity? If public authorities don't really take that into consideration, then there will be no the momentum as such given, no possibility of proving to your neighbor that it works. So that's why we need public authorities to intervene. You were talking about this new strategy concerning biodiversity. That means 30% more than protected areas. Are you talking of just greatly protected areas or what? Very protected areas. So how does conservation easement protect in addition to what you have already? And public authorities perhaps could cover areas which are not protected areas but which are classified as other methods of conservation. You have that International Convention on Biodiversity that has made this provision. Have you looked at that? And then once again for private land owners, how are they going to talk about transmission? Well, you asked, there were several ABCs to your question. Can I answer one of them about protected areas and about financing? And then maybe one of you or Fabrice, you could talk about how effective our measures are concerning biodiversity. No, concerning finance. No, you see, public authorities are not paying anything. This is just an agreement between two private parties. It could be with a public party, but no. It all depends on the kind of contract you signed. You might have a local municipality that signs up, or it could be, in all the OREs we talked about in France, we didn't have that. Public financing is just a possibility, but in all that we signed with the CEN, no, we haven't got it. Most that we've seen, there's no funding at all from public authorities. Alors, climate change. According to the law, these OREs must have a look at the conditions for all possible revisions of the contract, all changes and modifications, and possibility of cancellation. So I suppose that global warming in the long run will also be considered in the OREs or the French easements, especially if there's going to be a change in climate, etc., it will be included. Now you were talking of how effective these measures are. Again, it depends on the kind of contract. In general, all contracts signed by the CEN, there is a management plan. We have a regular stock taking and we see that the measures are quite effective. Once again, it depends on what you've signed up. It just depends on what you've signed up. And some of these could be recognized as a protection. Well, it all depends on the way you also monitor this effectiveness. Now, concerning the protected areas, it's not 30%. The idea is that in 2030 we have 30% of the coastal areas that be protected, plus 10% which are under very strong protection. And here we have OREs or conservation easements that have been recognized as such. And we study it on a case-by-case basis. And then, in addition to all that, there's the entire process of the regional council and so on that intervenes. Now, some of the other tools that might be recognized for very strong protection, you have certain sites which are now classified for landscape protection. And they are likely to have an impact naturally on biodiversity, but they are not classified as biodiversity protection, but which have an impact on it, so they should be recognized as such. Plus, there are other natural sites. You have certain wooded areas, woodlands, which are protected. And then you've also got coastal areas which are under, which are totally preserved. Or the ones that we call threatened areas or under threat. And some of these are private lands, so you sometimes have the local municipality stepping in or local associations stepping in to buy up these areas or these lands to protect them. I mean, now there's a long list, I don't have them all. Do you wish to add something, Fabrice? Yes, I can talk about financing. I know it's a real issue. I think for both stakeholders, or all three stakeholders, the farmers, as you mentioned, we have our colleague here from Ariège, and now he has a piece of land which is bigger than, which is quite big, really. So it could have a huge impact, concerning environmental and climatic changes, so he could be part of it. But as such, this hasn't been identified as an area which is running a possibility of water scarcity. But that's something that could be used. There's also other items like payment for environmental services, fees and things like that you could talk about it. Now, concerning private landowners, normally you get an exemption on land tax, but that's about it. For our federation, in the last few years, we've been trying to promote these sort of measures with Parliament. And this is based on the exemptions that you have for private landowners, which enables those who own forested areas to take advantage of certain tax exemptions. And then finally, for the people signing your conservation easement for our couple over here, for all the follow-up and so on, that has to be paid for. And for Christian and Marie-Hélène, we were able to get that labeling that it was a sensitive biodiversity area, but this was paid for by the local association. And then we also set up a special label for green funds, and 100,000 euros were paid out so that they could undertake some of the measures to protect the biodiversity. And then some of it might come from the very protected areas. The ministry isn't saying it, but I think that these strongly or very protected areas, sooner or later, will be conditioned to access to some of these, some of the funding. I suppose one could imagine it. Well, the green funds that you have in the January book is likely to have it. Yes, so financing is an issue. Quite right, yeah. Time for one more question. Whose turn is it? I've been trying to ask a question, and I'll do this very quickly. Thank you so much for talking about this exemption for non-constructed woodland areas. For 25 years now, I've been with the Natura 2000 system, and my question is, who said that obligation and commitment meant that it's a loss of value? That's not true. I find that there's added value with Natura 2000. I've defended it with private landowners, and at one point, the president of the association was against it, but as Natura 2000, when you sign up for a kind of charter for unconstructed areas, you can get an exemption of 5,000 euros a year on over 10 years or 12 years. Plus, any kind of work that you carry out on your property is paid for. So who said that you might lose out? Conservation easement only adds, I think, and it doesn't deduct from your value. There's absolutely no loss. So who said that conservation easement can lead to a loss in value? So we must fight that kind of misconception. I have a question on woodlands in the conservatory and other natural protected parks. There are certain isolated species, etc., that need to be protected. So if you follow Natura 2000, sorry, didn't understand that. Maybe you could give us some stats. What's your question? Or maybe you can answer the second one. Well, I was talking about the dead trees that you might have on certain properties. All we're saying is that you maintain them and you don't cut them down completely. And there's nothing said about remuneration. And in that case, I wouldn't have anything to offer. I was just going on the basis of all the tools that we have, Natura 2000 and protection of non-constructed areas. I have nothing else to add. However, there are certain woodland contracts that are made for certain islands of new trees, etc. How about the added value or not of conservation easement? Do you feel it's a loss, an economic loss? When you talk about it to other friends, other peasants, you immediately talk about the monetary aspect of it. Will I lose out in value? They often ask, how will we do it, in the future? So I say it's not our problem. It'll be the problem. It'll be our children's problem. We are handling the problem now, and then they'll handle it later. But the urgency is to protect the biodiversity, so you can forget about money for the time being. Other questions, Gilles Martin? And this gentleman who's raised his hands. Yeah, I'll give you the last question, Okay, so thanks so much for your enthusiasm and experience. I was really surprised to hear this morning that the ORE experience was unsuccessful. I thought it was absolutely successful. And figures that were provided prove it. But it's true that the government's report in 2021 added to the impression that it wasn't a success because this report wasn't based on any substantial proof. And they themselves said that they were going to stop in 2019. So it really gave an impression of no success. But today that's wrong. My personal stock taking, as far as I'm concerned, is on the basis of information that I receive. And of course, this is just approximate. I would say that today there are roughly 10,000 hectares that are covered by these conservation easements. And of course, I'm including all sorts of easements because I can't really differentiate between them. Now, concerning the agreement given by the farmer, of course, that's covered by law. But I'd like to point out that the law says that the farmer must motivate his refusal. So that means the judge eventually, if brought in, will have to make sure that the landlord is not deliberately refusing for monetary reasons. I don't think in the long run it would be a loss to be covered by a conservation easement, because I think that the economic value will follow the ecological value of your land. And one last point concerning these protected areas and the OREs. Yes, it's brilliant. Let's carry on. But then let's not introduce too many administrative restrictions, because I think the spirit behind a conservation easement is to make it easy. It is a kind of a contractual freedom. So let's try and avoid too much intervention by all the administrative authorities, because otherwise it'll just turn into a complicated mess. Yes, Fabrice? Well, concerning what Christian said and what Gilles Martin said, and this gentleman on the value of land which might be reduced, given that there is a biodiversity crisis and global warming. Think of all the land that has been sustainably protected by these OREs. Think of the fact that you wouldn't have exhausted all the resources and that you've protected things which would also bear a certain economic value. Today, of course, you don't see it. It's in the long run that you see the advantage. You're building up a green capital in natural resources which will become a market value capital. It'll be worth something, not nothing. Now, about the financial counterparties. As far as the CEN is concerned, in your regional natural parks, I think you have the same approach. On principle, we feel that when we lease out, we don't pay any financial counterpart to the farmers. And that's not have a two-tier system with those who are voluntarily signing up and those who are not. And so you're not really completely protecting nature for what it is, but for what it's worth. That's why we don't do it. So that's why we opted with it, with what we said. And it's true for this land in the Ariège. Public authorities and local municipalities through tax exemptions, etc., or other incentives provide some sort of encouragement. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, just one last question. Now, the president, for instance, of a natural park or a natural area, if he has been involved in this kind of easement, it's done very quickly. You don't really have to go through a notary, and it's much cheaper. So the ORE costs about 300 or 500 euros. It's very quick. Marie-Hélène? Fortunately, it doesn't cost thousands. Because it's really the life of thousands of insects and thousands of birds. And those don't have a value in euros, you know. It's 12. We have just one question and then we stop. I'm really quite pleasantly surprised that we are talking about farming, because I'm a farmer, I'm an owner, and I rent, and I think there are not very many breeders here. I live in the mountains. I have goat, and we sell straight from our farm in the Vosges area. And I have what we call a low agricultural potential. Everything that you said is brilliant. It's just great. I have 60 different vegetal species. I got a biologist to come in and count them. We're all talking about restrictions, but for me, these are not restrictions. We have them naturally. We have hedges, we have beautiful meadows, and we don't plow our meadows, because if you do that, you'll bring up more stone than anything else, and more pebbles, because it's a rocky area. And we know about all your restrictions, either naturally or thanks to the Common Agricultural Policy, the CAP. We are not allowed to cut trees. We are not allowed to cut our hedges. Each tree is counted. Each tree is labeled, thanks to the CAP. I have a number for all of them. You're talking about your surface, yes, which have been declared to the CAP. Yes. My entire CAP declaration has mapped everything. So everything is mapped. So all that you're talking about, I have it already. I know about it. So it's, you just live with it. That's all. And I'm quite happy to have so much biodiversity. So, at a pinch, I'd be able to sign your kind of contract. But I've done it without being forced to do anything. Now, why am I not signing your thing, your conservation easement? Firstly, I have the biodiversity, but the problem is, I've been to several conferences where you had the ministry represented and you were talking of ecosystemic services. But will we be paid for all that we've done already? And they said that we'll be helping those who've polluted a lot and who need to be helped. Those who've never polluted and who've always maintained nature, we get nothing. We get nothing. So, now you tell me if you agree or not. And that's why I'm not signing your conservation easement, because I'm afraid, and you'd mentioned it, and I'll tell you the decree. It was on the 12th of April 2022. I know that blooming decree, It was these very strong protection, because that means these OREs, the agricultural activity, we won't be able to carry it out. I asked Mr. Christophe Dessus directly through an email. I even spoke to him at a conference. Can I put in protective barriers if, for instance, I have an attack of certain insects and so on, can I have... So to sum up, what you're saying is, if you get this kind of strongly very protected area, will it be compatible with the kind of farming that you're doing? I'm afraid of that. I feel that I'm doing a lot for biodiversity, and I'm afraid that these new restrictions of very strong protection are going to limit me in what I'm doing. I already have a low agricultural potential. You're going to sacrifice me just to save an area which doesn't produce. I mean, I don't get it. Now, a very strong protection is voluntary. No one is going to force you. No part of the government is going to come and force you. No, they can't do it. It's just based on your own voluntary and willingness to do it. No one's going to force you to do it. I think you should sign up your conservation easement, and if you don't want to have a very strong protection, there's no problem. You won't get it. So all these OREs don't have this clause, and a lot of OREs or conservation easements don't have it because the manager or the owner will not ask for it. And there's no public departments that are going to force you to do it. That's just not possible. It's only if you want it. That's it. I want to reassure you. Well, thank you so much. I think that brings us to the end of our roundtable. We'd have loved to carry on our discussions, but I'm sure we'll be able to do it while we have lunch. Thank you all very much. It was really very interesting. And let's just move on to the next session.